Dun, 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 dun. Okay, wrong one. It's just the one that I grew up with. The first Zelda that I actually played. It was not the one on the original NES. It was Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. The obligatory disclaimer, by the way. Yeah, it's just a game, blah, blah. We all know about that. This is just overanalyzing for fun. Calm your tits. There you go, disclaimer. We look at this. I mean, Master Sword, standard. I've done a video about that a while ago. Tree branch and soup ladle, obviously the best weapons that you can possibly get. The spring-loaded hammer. Now here it gets funky. The description actually says being struck by it doesn't hurt much, which is perfectly appropriate because if you hit something with a spring, you compress the spring. A lot of the force that you put into it actually goes into compressing the spring as opposed to transferring the kinetic energy onto the target. And the problem with the spring-loaded hammer, if you tried something like that in real life, would be not only would you bounce back the enemies, you would also bounce back your arm, and in fact quite violently. If you have like this is supposed to hurl them around. If it literally sends the victim flying. The problem, this pesky thing called physics, the problem with that is that force has to go in both directions. So if there's enough force to bounce them back, it's also going to bounce the hammer back from them. So you may dislocate your shoulder trying to wield that thing, or you might be flung back yourself, which is not really a good trade-off, I think. The only way you could do that is if you were pushed against a wall and struck somebody, then, I mean, you wouldn't fly away, but you would be violently pushed against the wall and potentially flattened, which is not ideal either. So, yeah, this is obviously not an item that aims for realism, but if we were trying to make that in real life, this would cause some trouble, you know? The soldier's broadsword. Now, broadsword, I mean, I'm glad that it didn't call it longsword, because a lot of games make the mistake of calling an arming sword a longsword. This looks like it's an arming sword, although it could be a hand and a half or bastard sword, depending on the length. So that looks kind of fairly typical, like a medieval sword of that type. The knight's broadsword has the sort of flamberge blade going on, not quite. One weird thing about this guard here, generally swords, they tend to be taller than they are thick. This one is thicker than it's tall. The forest dweller sword. This is made of wood. Now, here's one major problem that I have with this. If we zoom in a little, these large notches there, if you made a wooden sword like this, guess where it would break? Right there. This is basically asking for the sword to break there. I mean, wood isn't as strong as steel to begin with, but this, we're having a problem here in practical terms. I'm not going to look at all of them and comment on every single one because that would take too long. The Zora sword is very much on the fantasy side of things, so much so that this starts to get difficult to even say much about. If you try to make something like this in real life, that would be pretty poorly balanced. It is made from a different metal, so at least weight may not actually be an issue. Balance, however, still is. Distribution of mass is still going to be a bit of an issue. However, if you shape it correctly, like the thickness, if you get that right with distal taper and everything, this could still work. Feathered edge. Supposed to be lightweight. Doesn't look like it. But, you know, if again, depending on the thickness and everything, I'm a little bit worried by the cutout in the center there. That could cause some trouble. Gerudo scimitar. This looks a lot like historical designs. There are certain Indo-Persian and Arabic daggers that are quite similar. Looks quite nice and practical. Moonlight scimitar, that's still definitely within the realm of the doable. Scimitar of the Seven, this is where it starts to get a little bit iffy. I mean, this is a huge blade, so this would have to be pretty thin You can do that, absolutely. There were falchions in history that have extremely wide blades and are very thin. Now, usually games don't get that right. They make them extremely thick. Rusty broadsword, not too much to say about that. That is very down-to-earth kind of design. The Royal Guard sword, I would say 2, aside from the fact that the guard is very large. Flame blade, magical. Yes, you can always pass that off, because this is not even a metal blade. This is, who knows what. But I do like the proportions overall, both the flame blade and the frost blade. And this is the thing, when I talk about fantasy designs and are they practical and everything, some people get super triggered because they're like, it's just fantasy, just a game, blah, blah, blah. But here's the thing. There's still certain rules about design and about aesthetics and proportions that you can follow. If the proportions are completely off, like if you have this super thin, spindly little toothpick of a handle and then a gigantic blade, it just looks dumb. It's not a good design, just aesthetically. These here, the proportions overall, they work. The Thunderblade is pushing it a little bit. This is pretty gigantic, but it's still just about okay, I think, in terms of shape, aesthetics, and everything. The blade being split in the center, personally not a fan of that, but it is a pretty cool aesthetic. You can say that. Great Boko Club. Patience, Lemon. We'll get to it. We will get to it. The Goddess Sword. That's actually quite a nice looking one. The Guard is again a little bit reminiscent of some Celtic swords. Gigantic wooden club. The thing is, it's easy to underestimate how heavy stuff like this gets. Depending on the wood, something of this size can get really freaking heavy. But of course, with a giant bludgeon, that's kind of the point. So yeah, here's a bit of an issue. It tapers so much that this is very likely to break. You have to taper it quite a bit, of course, to make for a handleable handle, technical term. But yeah, Spike Boko Club, this is getting crazy. Like, this is really taking it to an extreme. I can appreciate the design, though, for what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a very primitive weapon, and yeah, it looks like it's got these bones just tied to it, like literally just tied. And not even tied very well. Not very intricate, which it's absolutely not supposed to be. Dragon Bone, Boko Club, yeah, again, giant. There's not really too much to say here. It's a giant, crude club. That's exactly what it's supposed to be. The Lynel Boomerang. Now, I wouldn't call that a boomerang, but it is kind of a cool design. I'm not a fan of the saw teeth here. We'll get to that later. These two are directly inspired by African throwing weapons. This general arrangement of several blades with points poking in different directions, that's definitely inspired by real life things. Guardian Sword. On these, the grips don't look very comfortable. And my main problem with this is giant notches in them. This is the kind of thing that will just get stuck in whatever you're trying to damage. Okay, so the Guardian weapons are really supposed to be just energy blades. They look like some kind of high-tech transparent metal, but if it is an energy blade, I mean, at that point you really don't need the cutouts and notches and serrations and everything. If it's an energy blade, okay. If you really insist on it for aesthetic reasons, then okay, fine. That works. The magical stuff, the rods, I mean, I can't really say anything about that. This is really where you just have to let the game have its fun. I mean, you have to do that anyway. But yeah, there isn't really much to say. It's a magic rod. What can you possibly say about the practicality, right? The Demon Carver is basically a spiked chakram with a handle, which makes it really bizarre. This would be better for throwing, actually. The other problem is, again, giant spikes. So if you imagine you strike at something and the spikes enter between two ribs or something, they will get stuck there immediately. So if you try to do like a slash, which you would do with a ring blade, so you need a bit of a slice in there. But if you have these points sticking out, as soon as they enter, as soon as they hit something hard, like bone, they will stop. And the slice will stop there, it won't continue. So you'll probably just chop into them, then the damn thing gets stuck, and then they chop your head off because you can't free your weapon in time, and they are still mostly okay. I mean, okay-ish. Would Lynel's having 4 legs affect the design of the blade? Not necessarily. I mean, there's would be one thing about having 4 legs that could help. You have a more stable platform. You have, like, your stance is better. So meaning that you can probably transfer more power into your swings through the use of that, and that in turn means that you don't really need something that freaking heavy. You can just generate more force just with the muscles of your body at that point. So you can just make up for that with velocity and, proper body mechanics. The more body weight you can put behind the swing, the more power it's going to have. And in that sense, more body weight means more powerful chop or slash or what have you. So here's a point that I wanted to make about claymores, because these swords here, these have nothing to do with a claymore in any sense of the word, even in the inaccurate manner in which the term is usually used. Let's put it that way. So what people usually think of when they say claymore is a two-handed Scottish sword. Something like this is usually considered a claymore, but those are not actual claymores, at least in the way the term was originally used. The term makes an appearance in the 18th century, and what that refers to is a single-handed basket-hilt sword. So this would be an actual claymore. The great sword basically is what became known as a claymore in Victorian times, but the correct term claymore refers to this, the basket-hilt broadsword. And these were just referred to as two-handed swords. It's just that you can call them great swords, but yeah, these are not the typical shape, because what you normally have with a claymore, or what is inaccurately called a claymore, is this very characteristic guard with the quillons that point upward at an angle and have the quatrefoil on the ends here. These would work though. Like you could definitely make those in real life and they would be just fine. This you could still make, just like the version of the Armor Slayer that somebody made for me for a video. It's possible. You can do that. The Royal Claymore, this is where it gets too extreme. Like the guard is so huge, and it's got additional metal on the surface for decoration, and the blade is really wide. I don't think you could salvage that. I mean, if you wanted to be close to the look of the original design, you couldn't make this without being a huge hunk of metal that is unwieldy. Silver longsword, yeah, this would also be difficult to do properly. Also, this point here, this would cause all kinds of trouble in real life. Because if you thrust with this is going to enter easily on the way in, and then the point sticking out in the opposite direction will probably hook on bone and snag really bad. So basically, this is like a harpoon almost. This would go in easily, but then it gets stuck, and yeah, you're left without a weapon essentially. Here we're getting into the real fantasy kind of stuff that you couldn't pull off in real life. Wielded by Gorons, which are much more massive than other species, and particularly humans are also very strong, etc., etc. So you can argue that in this world that works, but in real life it definitely wouldn't. Now here we get to the fun things. Ancient blade saw. So this actually spins like a chainsaw, and if I designed this, I would have made the teeth a lot smaller. I think that would look better. That would also look more useful. Now again, if it's an energy blade, technically it doesn't matter, depending on exactly how it works. If it just, oh, it's pure energy, it just cuts right through or whatever, then essentially at that point the shape doesn't matter. If the shape matters a little bit, then it would definitely be better to have much smaller teeth. If there's a bit of resistance potentially, then you could very much get clothing stuck in there, bunch up, and make it snag and everything. That's a really cool weapon. I'm not even going to argue. That's cool. Even if it's impossible in real life, that's really cool. And you want things that are impossible in real life, in fantasy. Otherwise it would be boring, right? If it was just stuff that is plausible. The Fierce Deity Sword. Now, this, again, of course, classic. Difficult to make. This would be quite challenging. But it's possible. Did Men-at-Arms make this at some point? I vaguely remember. It might be. You're basically using a two-handed sword that's made up of two individual curved one-handed sword blades. That's how you can look at it. If you look at them separately, if you imagine this is one curved sword, this is the other, they're just connected, welded together, I suppose, on the guard and at the point. Yeah, it's actually not as crazy as it looks at first glance, I would say. If the energy blade really just enters everything without much resistance that it touches, then you can shape them however you want. With one exception, you probably don't want anything pointing your way. That's a bit of a concern here. Also, there is no guard. This is really my main problem with these. There is no guard aside from the energy blade. So if you slip up on this, what, your hand is gone? Because it just goes, the energy blade just sears right through it. Or something that will be a bit of a problem. There definitely needs to be some kind of guard and non-energy guard that separates your hand from the dangerous part. Otherwise, you'll be in trouble. So that's really the main problem I see with this. The Zora spear, this has very prominent barbs, probably inspired by harpoons. So this, again, it goes in and is never coming out. This would just be stuck in the opponent's body very quickly. The Silver Scale Spear, it's really not so much a spear. You can't really thrust with that properly because this is completely out of alignment. You could try to thrust like straight forward to try to catch someone's neck in the curved edge, but that's about it. Otherwise, you could thrust at angles, but it would limit quite a bit what you can do. The trident is just too huge, and this wouldn't go very far at all because you've got such a steep angle on that point. It's a very wide blade. And then you've got the additional resistance of having 2 points on the side. So this would probably enter like this far maybe, and that's it. So that would limit the efficiency. Gerudo Spear, that is really oversized. And this is what I said earlier, the point I made about proportions. This is what makes this kind of ugly to me because the proportions are off. You have the spindly shaft in comparison to a huge blade and an even larger guard. I really like the Guardian Spear. That is pretty awesome. That is a very nice design for an energy spear. Works perfectly. Again, got little notches and serrations, but again, if it's an energy blade, shouldn't matter. The Guardian Spear plus, I'm not actually a fan of the extra piece there. I prefer the original version because it's nice and slender and elegant looking. The plus is just getting a bit far. I mean, I see what they did there. They just, here's an extra piece, and now we mirror that piece, and it makes sense for an upgrade. Overall, I have to say that I do like the weapons in this game. From a design perspective, they do fit in the world, and aesthetics are usually pretty good, with some exceptions. Like in some cases, they just screwed over the proportions too much for them to really look good. But I think overall they did a quite good job. And it's the kind of weapon that, the blade saw. How can you not like that? That's badass. And it's a good kind of badass. It's not completely It is ridiculous, don't get me wrong, but it's the good kind of ridiculous. I could explain how fragile the weapons are. If the blacksmiths are not very good at judging the temperature, and they just don't leave them in the fire for long enough, and then the metal is too cold, and they hammer it aggressively while cold, you can get all kinds of microfractures and cracks and everything, and that would lead to something being really brittle. Even worse, if they heat treat it but don't temper it, or don't temper it properly. Didn't do the stream as well as I hoped, but I hope you still had fun either way. Thanks for showing up, and I'll see you next time.